friends. I am Dr. Harvinder Singh, and we are back with our next video lecture series. And in this topic, we will talk about grief, persistent complex bereavement disorder, and prolonged grief disorder. And this will be discussed in three sections. And this is our first section, but just to summarize, in first section we will compare grief versus major depressive episode. In second section we will compare persistent complex bereavement disorder versus prolonged grief disorder. In third, we will discuss what questions to ask. This third section is more clinical in nature. I have created a PDF file of all the questions that you need to include in your evaluation. And I have compiled these questions from first and second section. And the only thing is that first and second section here will be available for free, but this third section is only available as a chapter to our Physician's Guide for Clinical Psychiatry subscribers. So, without wasting any time, let's begin our part number 1 of this lecture series. And in this section, we will discuss difference between grief and major depressive episode. So, before we begin, I just want to say this, that we know in DSM-4 there was this specifier, bereavement exclusion criteria. In that, we know that major depressive disorder was not diagnosed for first 2 months if a person is meeting criteria for grief. But we know that this is removed in DSM-5. So it's very important step, I believe, that was taken, because we know how a loss can be a very big triggering factor for worsening of major depressive disorder, especially for a person who is high risk. So by removing that exclusion criteria, a psychiatrist, a physician, is cautious to evaluate every person rather than not keeping that in mind for first 2 months. Now, let's discuss what is the difference between grief and major depressive episode. And I have compiled this information from various resources, but the main resource here is our DSM-5. So, this is a very short video lecture, but very important one. So, the first criteria is the difference on predominant affect. In grief, the predominant affect is the feeling of emptiness and loss, whereas in major depressive episode, it's the persistently depressed mood and inability to anticipate happiness or pleasure. Now, it's very important to keep in mind the persistent part is very important here. Now, that makes our point number 2 about progression. With grief, grief is likely to decrease in intensity over coming days to weeks. And this is also called pangs of grief. So these dysphoria mostly decrease with time. And these waves that we are talking right now, in grief, they are mostly associated with the thoughts or reminders of the deceased. Whereas the depressed mood of major depressive episode is more persistent, as we talked about. And mostly it's not associated to specific thoughts or preoccupation. And the third difference here is the associated emotions with dysphoria. An important thing with grief is that the pain of grief may be accompanied by positive emotions and humor, which are not present in major depressive episode. There, it's more persistence of pervasive unhappiness and misery. So that's point number three. The fourth point difference here is in thought content. In grief, it's mostly comprised of preoccupation with thoughts and memories of the deceased. Whereas in major depressive episode, thought content is mostly of self-critical in nature or pessimistic rumination. Now, with the grief, this preoccupation with thoughts and memories of the deceased, we will discuss this more in our second part video lecture. But that's point number four in difference between grief and major depressive episode. Fifth difference is in self-esteem. In grief, self-esteem is mostly preserved, whereas in major depressive episode, a person have feelings of worthlessness, self-loathing, thereby affecting their self-esteem. And the last and I think very important difference is thoughts about death. So in grief, if they are present, it will mostly involve these perceived failings related to the deceased person. Examples, as you can see here, is that I have not visited him or her frequently enough. I'm not telling, I should have told the person how much I love them. So these perceived failing thoughts results in those thoughts of death in grief. And also, these thoughts are mostly focused on a deceased and possibly joining the deceased. Whereas in major depressive episode, these thoughts are more focused on self rather than on a deceased person. So these thoughts are more focused on ending one's own life. Because, the because is very important here. Because of feeling worthless, undeserving of life, unable to cope with pain of depression. So these are the main differentiating point that DSM-5 talks about. And also important point I want to make here is this major depressive episode applies to major depressive episode of major depressive disorder and major depressive episode of bipolar disorder also. So friends, this was a very brief overview of difference between grief and major depressive episode. I hope this was educationally meaningful and important for everyone. And I will post part two of this lecture series hopefully soon this week, by the end of this week. Please do subscribe to our weekly email newsletter. This way you can stay up to date of our website post, YouTube videos, any new course chapter addition to Physician's Guide for Clinical Psychiatry, and any new announcement. You can join us by going to this link, join-newsletter.subscribemenow.com. I will put all the information below if you're interested. And in the end, I just want to say, if you're interested in learning more, we have a Physician's Guide for Clinical Psychiatry course, and I think we are about to reach 250 chapters now, which will happen very soon in next 2 weeks. And I'm so excited to say this again that we just released our first CME conference. You will get after enrolling, you are eligible to get maximum of 10 AMA PRA Category 1 credits. We have very important 9 clinically relevant topics here. So friends, I'll stop talking. Thank you again for watching this video. Please wait for the second video and let me know if you find this helpful by posting your replies below. You all have a good day, and if you have any questions or anything you want me to talk about, you can contact me at psychiatryeducationforum@gmail.com. Thank you. Take care. Bye.